Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to welcome all of you once again to our Wednesday night class. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to bless all of you and allow you to live lives of usefulness and ambition, and that hopefully when you leave the planet, people remember you for all the beautiful things that you try to do to make a difference in the world. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, most importantly, reward us with a great reward after our term on the planet has come to an end. Tonight we're discussing the issue of the moon in Islam. It's a very one of those things which really, more than any other issue, creates so much confusion among our community that it becomes almost embarrassing to have to explain to people who are not Muslims why we have all this confusion. You know, if Islam is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why we don't even know what day we have to celebrate our Eid, and to explain to co-workers why we don't know yet when time is coming and all of that. It really gets to become an embarrassing thing. And every year we go through this, mainly in the time of Ramadan, because all the other months we're supposed to track them, but it is essential to track in Ramadan because we need to know when the day of fasting begins. And so that's when the whole issue comes to the fore, the beginning of Ramadan, when it starts, and then we have the same discussion at the end of Ramadan. When does Ramadan end? And so tonight, the presentation is more or less to just give us some of the broad parameters. I have deliberately avoided going into all of the pros and cons discussion that occurs among the scholars. For the layperson, all they're interested in is, let me know when I have to start Ramadan and when I have to end Ramadan. A lot of the lay Muslim are not interested in all the theoretical discussions behind what creates that decision. But because we're students of knowledge here, we're going to learn a little bit more. But I've also avoided delving into very great detail. For those of you who would like to go into great detail about some of this issue, I will recommend a book at the end. There are several books that you can listen to, and also several videos if you want to become really expert at this. So let's go into it and see, what we can understand. So the first thing to know is a couple of initial information that we need to understand about the Islamic system and calendar. Muslims, the Jews also follow a lunar calendar in which our days of the year are based on the sighting and determined by the presence of the moon. We live in a society in which we are following a solar calendar. The solar calendar also have problems, but they have found a way to add an extra day every 4 years. You have something called a leap year. And so in order to correct the calculations for this, based on the rotation of the Earth around the Earth, they just add an extra day and says, okay, in February, every 4 years, we can just add a day to fix the problem. So there's always been a problem. There was, I forget which year it was, in which the solar calendar, they lost 11 days in which this didn't exist. In October sometime, there was 11 days that was missing. The lunar calendar has been found to be very simple and systematic, and they don't lose that kind of content. So what happens is, because it corrects within the year, so the days of the month are determined, the months of the year are determined by the coming of the moon, the moon that rotates around the Earth. And every 29 or 30 days, the Islamic month, each of it has either a 29-day month or you have a 30-day month. And so you will have some of the in the Islamic calendar, some of the days will be end of 29 days and some will be end of 30 days. The other thing to know is that the the day in the Islamic calendar starts from the night. They count from night and then day. So after Maghrib, the evening prayer after sunset of, say, for example, tonight is Wednesday night. So a new day for Islam will begin when we had Maghrib today. That's when the new day begins. And then that day will continue until tomorrow, until Maghrib, then a new day. So the night comes before the day and not the day before the night. So that's something to know also. So why we look for the moon on the night of a particular night, then we know that the next day would be the first day of the month if we see the moon. And the birth of the moon is what determines the beginning of the month. And when Ramadan comes around, we have to decide and figure out how do we determine the birth of the moon in order to discover the starting of Ramadan. And over a period of time, several different ways of deciding how to determine the birth of the moon, different methods have been used to determine how we figure out the birth of the moon. And it is these different methods that is chosen by the Muslims in the various parts of the world that seems to create some problems. Certainly, Eid and beginning and ending of Ramadan is something that Muslims want to unify about. We want to have unity about it. But unity does not mean uniformity. Unity does not mean that everybody, because practically when part of the earth is night, another part of it is day. So you will never have a unified time when everybody, let's say at 5 o'clock on this day, we're going to do something, because 5 o'clock here will mean 8 hours later in England and so on. So the globe, the way it is, you don't have one time where everybody celebrates. So it becomes an impractical thing to just pick a day and says, everybody follow the day, because some people not be even in that day. Now, a large part of the problem that occurs with this discussion is around an issue which has been around for a long time and which is really important to understand. And that is, when the Prophet ﷺ came, he established the different practices in Islam as was instructed to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the instructions he gave was suitable and valid and easy for the people of his time. He had a society which was basically Makkah, Medina, not such a large community. It wasn't into different countries and so on. And so his practices was based on particular systems that was easy for the people at the time. The Sharia has an objective that it tries to make things easy for people. But then technology arrives. And whenever technology arrives, the Muslims now are placed in a position where they want to use the latest technology without taking away the essence of what the worship is. So the discussion of how do we use a technology without compromising the goal and objective of a particular worship or a particular practice or a particular principle. And so this has always been a discussion among Muslims. How do you use this technology? To what extent you use this technology? When is it applicable? When is it going beyond and taking away the original intent of that worship? And I'll give you some examples that we have had of this fight that goes on all the time. For example, the Prophet ﷺ taught us that the way you determine the salah, they lived in a desert, is that you check the shadow of a particular object. So if the shadow of an object, you take a piece of stick and you stick it in the desert, and if the shadow reaches equal length, then you know the time of Zuhr prayer has started. And if the shadow reaches double length, then you know the time of Asr has started. And then if you see the sun set, you know that Maghrib has started, and so on. And if you see the twilight disappear and become dark night, then Isha has started. And in the morning, he also gives instruction of how you can determine the Fajr when the dawn is distinguished, as we'll come to. And so this was the system the Muslims used. This was what was the Prophet ﷺ, when Jibril came and explained this to him, and the Prophet ﷺ was able to bring this to us. So what they used to have in the old days, where they would put a pole in the masjid and they would measure the shadow. So that's how you get to know whether the salat time reaches. But then came the ability to, you don't need the pole, you don't need the shadow, because we can calculate with a watch the exact time when that shadow is going to be equal, the exact time when it's going to be doubled, and so on. And so there was a big fight. Should we move away from this pole? Is it going to compromise anything? And then the decision was made, we will use watches, because the goal is really to find the right time of prayer. The goal is not whether you're measuring a shadow or a pole. That is just a means towards an end. And so using the watch will also accomplish that end. And I'm spending a little while on it because I want you to understand this will come over and over throughout our lives. So the Muslims, after much discussion and disagreement, eventually unanimously, everybody now, nobody measures shadows anymore, right? But you still have that available to you. Should you find yourself in a desert without any watch, you still have this opportunity to be able to use the sun as a way to know the salah. So that remains there as a rule that sits, but in case you don't have a technology available in the moment. But that's how we use the watch now. Then fasting in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the ayah in the Quran mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ مِنَ الْفَجْرِ ثُمَّ أَتِمُّوا الصِّيَامَ إِلَى اللَّيْلِ. That eat and drink until the white thread of the dawn can be distinguished from the black thread, then complete the fast until nightfall. And what is understood by this is that the companions, they used to keep with them when they go to bed a white thread and a black thread. And in the morning, they would look at it, and when they can distinguish it clearly, that the black from the white, they can recognize them as separate, that's when they determine that they should stop eating and fasting has begun. So they had this system. Now we're able to, with, again, technology, we use a watch. We can determine exactly when the dawn occurs, when the sunset occurs, and so on. And so we have Ramadan charts in which it has been computed. And so after much fights and disagreements, the Muslims finally adopted this because, again, it does not take away the objective of the idea is to find when fasting starts, when fasting ends. And so if the technology can work for that, then you will do that. And this has been always the case throughout so many issues that the Muslims faced and then they begin to adopt technology after much discussion. One of it, for example, is in the Hajj. You used to have to go and pelt a post. There are 3 posts, and because of the large volume of people that had to pelt this small post, pelting shaitan as one of the rituals in the Hajj, many people were killed. Because you can imagine you have a post standing there, and then millions of people are converging it from every direction, right? And then when you go and you reach close enough where you think you can pelt, how do you come out back? Now you have to turn around and go against the crowd that is coming towards you. And it became, sometimes if you slip and you fall there, you get trampled. And it was a very dangerous thing. And every year, a lot of Muslims were killed in this process, in the middle of trying to do this worship. And they debated and discussed, and eventually today now when you go, there's no longer a pole, there's a wall, a 20-foot by 20-foot big wall that you can pelt, and you move in one direction, you pelt on the wall, and you keep moving. So the scholars of Islam, they make these fatwas or these decisions based on what is easy for the people and without compromising the worship. And so they go into these debates and they come up with a solution And this was a solution that they came up. They also extended the amount of time needed to pelt because it was a limited time. And so that got expanded and that became a solution to the problem. And it did not compromise the worship itself. In fact, it saved lives. And throughout is like this. When microphones came, you had people saying microphone is un-Islamic to read the Quran through a microphone or to tape it on a cassette. That's not Quran. Quran has to be said from the mouth of someone. It cannot be taped and transmitted. And you will always have this kind of discussion till eventually they figure out a way of using the technology. Even to the extent of the tasbih, saying, because the Prophet ﷺ, he uses fingers and the little joints in the fingers to count. And then they said, if you use a bead, it is like going against the religion because the Prophet uses fingers. But eventually that came accepted. Even lines on the salah and so on, and goes on and on and on. All right. So I want you to know that that is a debate that has always existed and will continue to exist as we try to find more and more different ways of making things easy for people with the advent of technology. Now, in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the prophets mentioned in Hadith that fast when you see the new moon and stop fasting when you see it. And if it is, in other words, you look for the moon on the 29th to look to see if the fasting should start. If you see the moon, you fast, and you stop fasting when you see it at the end of Ramadan. But if it is cloudy and you can't see it, the sky is kind of cloudy, then fast for an extra day, 30 days, complete the days of the month. So because the day is either 29th or 30, the Ramadan could be 29 days. If you don't see the moon on the 29th, then complete 30, and then you know for sure the next day will be Eid after that 30, because the month can't have more than 30 days. Right? Now this hadith exists, and now all kinds of, that's what I'm trying to avoid the scholars. The scholars now have looked at this hadith and they have brought out now many, many, many things from it. First thing you notice is fast when you see it. What does see it mean? In the time of the Prophet, it meant see it with your eyes. But now we have technology, we have telescope. Does this hadith facilitate us to see the moon with a telescope? Or the Prophet ﷺ is saying literally, you have to see it with your naked eye. So now you have this discussion again, where technology gets discussed. And so you have scholars giving different fatwas on it, like this Sheikh Ibn Usaymin, who was one of the very learned sheikhs in Saudi Arabia. With regard to using a telescope to see the crescent, there's nothing wrong with it, but it is not necessary because the apparent meaning of the Sunnah is that we should rely upon ordinary sighting and not anything else. But if it is used and the moon is sighted by a trustworthy person, then this sighting may be acted upon. In the past, people used that because they had to climb up the minarets on the night before the 30th of Sha'ban and the night before the 30th of Ramadan and look for it by means of a telescope. So here you have an opinion about the telescope. The other discussion that's centered around this is that the people who the Prophet said, look for it if you see it, there's discussions about how good is the eye of the person. Is this person regarded as a person who sees okay, or he has weak eyesight? And so on. So a lot of technical discussions like this gets revolved. But suffice to say that the way the Prophet ﷺ recommended in his time was that we have to see the moon. And this was the standard way that people figured out the beginning and the end of Ramadan. All right. Then came the discussion about if you do see the moon, who is it valid on? Who are the people who it will be obligatory upon? Because we now have a situation where if the Prophet ﷺ in his community, they see the moon, is that valid for someone who lives in a village a little way further down, who may not have seen the moon in their area? Can they now adopt that? Bear in mind, there was the communication between villages at that time was also non-existent. When you can't communicate this message from one to the next, even though they used to have people with horses would ride to the next city and inform about news. But the decision now of does this moon sighting, how do we decide which village and which community it is valid in? Right. So that became another discussion. Right. And then they had an incident which, with a long discourse, I don't know if we did put the hadith, yeah, this long discourse in which um, somebody uh, they had the sighting in Mecca, and then they had somebody who was in Syria. So he arrived in Syria, and he did business, and in there, when he was there, the month of Ramadan started because the people in Syria saw the moon. So he began his Ramadan following the people in the moon in Syria, and so he saw the moon. And then before the end of the month, he traveled back to Medina. And so the end of the month, he found himself in Medina now, right? And so now he had a problem because the people in Medina, they did not see the moon in the same night or the same time as the one in Syria, right? So they saw it the night of the Friday, and he said, and so the other people saw it on Saturday. So he had a dilemma in terms of what to do. And so there was a fatwa had to be made. And basically the understanding was that he has to follow, that both sightings were valid, and he basically break the fast with the people of Medina. The scholars have discussed about what constitutes a region in terms of a sighting. There's some opinions that it's 82 kilometers in a circle. That distance, that whoever is at that circle will follow the sighting of the moon in that area. Others, they've said, well, if you have people in a particular time zone, like horizons, then the sighting of the moon in any of that time zone, that horizon, will be that moon sighting will be valid for them. Another says, well, it depends upon the imam of that particular nation or state will make the decision. And so among the four imams, you have different imams. So there's the opinion of Shafi and Hanbali that this is some of the opinions that they have. And so you have this regional sighting approval, in which is one way of determining if you should fast. If anybody in your region see the moon, as defined by these things, same horizon, same hemisphere, then you have to fast. Then the discussion went in terms of global sighting. And so this opinion says that the Prophet ﷺ, when he mentioned that fast when you see the moon and break your fast when you see it, the Prophet ﷺ did not specify when you see the moon in Medina and when you break your fast when you see the moon in Medina. He left it without any qualifications to it. So they said this means that really whoever sees the moon first in any part of the world, then it is valid on every Muslim in every part of the world. So this now, and they use the same hadith. It says that the Prophet ﷺ, the intent was that whoever sees the moon, then this is valid for every single person on the planet. And the Prophet did not specify only Medina. Now, even some of the scholars who hold this opinion also have a finer difference of opinion in terms of what global means. They don't really mean the whole world. They actually sectionize the world itself. Then there's another opinion about what this means, saying any country west of the country that sees the moon, this is binding on them because that comes after. But any country that is east of them, then it's not binding. So I'm just giving you tips of the kind of discussion and insight. It's not for us really as non-scholars, but to get you to understand the detail in which the discussion goes, right? The Hanafi, Maliki, and Hanbali schools uh, adopt some of this, the opinion about global sighting. And then there's a case now for calculations that we're not going to use sighting of the moon to determine when the moon was born. We're actually going to calculate it. Now, the early jurists, the early Islamic positions were that calculation was completely incorrect. And part of the problem was that because in that time, in the very early days of the Prophet ﷺ, the skill to calculate the exact birth of the moon, that technology was not fully perfected at that time. And so calculation was considered to be very, very unreliable. And so all the early Jews, majority of them rejected calculation because it was not seen as a viable option, even though some of them had proposed it, but it was not seen because of the science itself was not did not have the certainty in which was needed. And a lot of times people also mixed up astronomy with astrology. Astrology is considered haram. Astronomy is considered a science. So you have a group of the Sunni school, with the exception of Hanbali. From very early, they had begun this discussion among themselves of accepting calculations. Now we have today developed this science to such a level of accuracy that we can determine exactly when the moon is, right? So now we have the science that is developed. Initially, Muslims began to use it as a way of negating sightings. So, for example, the Muslims use calculation to say the moon can only be sighted at 2 o'clock, from after 2 o'clock on Thursday. So if someone comes up and say they saw the moon before that, the Muslim scholars would say it is impossible because of calculation to see the moon before that. So calculation was used as negating false sightings because the astronomers, they said, look, it's impossible for the moon to have been born at this time. And if anyone claimed they saw the moon before that, they are incorrect. And so this was one of the ways in which the Muslim scholars initially started to use calculation as a negating tool for false sightings. And then finally, the discussion came around, can we use it as an affirming tool? In other words, to say, now we know when the birth of the moon is, why don't we use that as the basis and the methodology of actually using it to say the moon will be born at this time, and so we'll begin our Ramadan at this time, right? Again, this have and continue to have great discussions among the scholars because they're seen as contrary to what the Prophet says. The Prophet said, when you see the moon, fast. He didn't say when you calculate the moon, fast. And so you have discussion of how, despite this hadith, how calculation is still valid, that the scholars go into in great detail. Part of it being that the sighting and all of this stuff is just a means towards an end. The end is to get the accurate beginning of Ramadan. And if calculation can do that, that supersedes, because the whole idea of the goal is to find when Ramadan should begin. And whatever methodology you use is not an end in itself. So obsessing over just sighting and the methodology is not where the argumentation, it's in determining and finding an accurate time of when that Ramadan will fast. And slowly over time, many of the Muslim scholars have begun to come around, as with all the other technology that always seems to have big discussion. A lot of the scholars are slowly, increasingly accepting calculation as a way of determining the beginning of Ramadan. And the there has been many of the big scholars have also come out and supported this methodology of using calculation. There's a detailed discussion of the birth of the moon and the visibility of the moon that also gets involved in this discussion, right? It can be born, but can we see it? So scholars are of this calculation position says it is irrelevant whether it's visible or not. We know it was born based on the calculation at this time, and that's what is important. And then finally, the Fiqh Council of North America, the Islamic North American Islamic Council and the Fiqh Council in Europe, they finally decided after many years of trying different methods and it all lead to a lot of issues, have adopted that the criteria in which they recommend that the Muslims should use to select the beginning and end of Ramadan should be by calculation. Now, this now allows us the ability to be able to determine the exact birth of the moon for every single month from now until the next 50 years. And they have actually worked out, calculated, I've seen charts in which they have the moon of the beginning of Ramadan worked out until 2035, 2040, every particular year when Ramadan will begin, when it will end. So now the uncertainty of the birth of the moon goes away, and this has been adopted. Now you have almost 65% of Muslims in America, of the masjids in America, have slowly migrated to this position. I want you to bear in mind that the position of global, the position of local sighting, the position of calculation, all of these are valid positions, and whichever Muslim pick any one of them, it should not be a source of argumentation among you. Whichever one you pick that is convenient and you believe firmly is the correct thing, if you believe that we have to see it locally, that's perfectly fine. If you believe that it has to be globally accepted, there are also some people who believe that it only has to be seen in Saudi Arabia. So there's another fringe group like that as well. So each of these they have evidence for them, and they have counter evidence, and they have big, long discussions, all right, which is not the purpose of our session. Just to know that if you hear one of your Muslim brothers taking global position, don't go fight him. If you see someone, and don't make an issue out of it. And if you see someone going local, it's not an issue to fight. But the benefit of having calculation is as follows. In the old days, in America, one of the problems you used to have is that we don't know if Eid is going to fall today or tomorrow. So some of the masjids, they will have to book a hall for 2 days, which means they have to pay double money to make sure that they have a venue for the Eid. So they're not sure which one it is. So you have to book the hall for today, and you have to book the hall for tomorrow. You will have to reserve a security for today and reserve one for tomorrow. And so it ended up being a costly affair, this uncertainty. Also, workers having to take 2 days off because they're not sure which one Eid will fall on. Now you have certainty with calculation. So you know exactly when Eid is coming a year before, 2 years before. And so now workers can take time off, they can plan. It also helps us to plan for Eid properly. You know exactly when it is. Kids can schedule, or if they have surgery or exams or whatever it is, the Muslims can schedule their activities now around that. All members of the family can now go, because even the weak ones in the family who are not practicing so much will know upfront that this is the day of Eid and they can plan for it. And so by having this certainty with calculation, you know, it brings a lot of new benefit. As I said, almost 60% of the masjid. There are some masjids who the imams are in favor of it, but the community is not ready. And so the imams don't recommend it, even though they personally would love to have their masjid. That happened to me, actually. I must confess to you that when I became imam, I've been imam for 10 years. And part of the problem I had was that I didn't think my community was ready to accept calculation. Right. So I waited and then finally, after consulting and trying to convince the leadership of our community, they eventually acceded and we made the decision that we are going to move to calculation. And I think it's been like 4 years now. We have moved to calculation, and instead of waiting for Saudi and waiting for local siting. The difficulty with local siting, look, you had my son's masjid, local siting, they got announced at 1 o'clock in the morning that, hey, we just saw the moon and you Eid is tomorrow, which is Eid is like today, basically. So at 1 o'clock now, they have to start making preparations to fast that day. The uncertainty and the difficulty it makes for a community is really incredible. And so, uh, the as a summary, the scholars they discuss, and they're really mainly all of them are concerned with making sure we don't compromise the principle of the particular thing, particular ruling, or the particular worship. And so they all try to find a way that will make it easy for Muslims. So they discuss the eye and the telescope, they discuss the hemisphere and the local um, and calculation and non-calculation. And so the scholars have many detailed discussions. As I said, I have deliberately not gone into doing and discussing with that in great detail. Now, what the scholars recommend is really very important for the lay person. They say for the lay Muslim, the ordinary Muslim, all right, one of the most important thing is not to try to become a scholar of this. Don't go about trying to defend your position of whatever you adopt. It is not useful discussion. You end up causing more confusion because you have not mastered all the nuances of the discussion and how the decisions are arrived at and how the evidence are put forth. So do not get involved in this. One of the most heated things is this discussion of moon sighting because it seems to viscerally disunite the Muslims. I have heard imams that says, local sighting is the right way, and I challenge anyone who can prove me wrong. I will give them $1,000. That's how passionate people are about this issue. And this is somebody from our community. They challenge people $1,000. If you can show I'm wrong, you know, that it is not local sighting is the correct way, I will give you $1,000. So it is a passionate discussion, like people discussing sports and sports teams and so on. Please don't get involved in this discussion. Okay? So the scholars have recommended that we should keep away from that. It requires certain amount of expertise, and there are lots of nuanced things which I have not indicated to you here. I just want you to get the available valid position so you can get an idea. So we should not allow it to cause disunity. The recommendation of North American Fiqh Council and the Assembly of Muslim Jurists in America, they disagree on the issue, right? And so, but yet what they agree on is that the local ordinary Muslim should follow their local masjid. When it comes to the moon sight and preference, don't make up your own stuff. Whatever masjid you're going to, whatever masjid your family is attending, and all of us should be attached to a local masjid. I have had a class in which I highlighted the benefits of being involved in an Islamic community, because we have had cases where people die and they are not attached to a community and they don't know who will bury them. They have no relationship with the community. You need to have a relationship with your local masjid. When you have people coming, they run to the masjid when they have to get a wedding to find somebody to marry their kid. They're not connected to the masjid at all. When somebody die in their community, then suddenly they need a Muslim community, or, so they come to the imams begging, for this service. So do not be like that. Make sure you're attached to a particular masjid in which you're contributing and which you're helping out. And so follow your local community is the high recommendation of all the scholars on this issue. Whatever your local community does, the scholars themselves do this. And they have evidence for this, in that even though you may have individually hold a different position, but if your local community is there, unity is more important. You just follow your local masjid. They had an incident with Ibn Abbas. He held a position that was different from Uthman ibn Affan, the fourth caliph, the third caliph, about whether you should shorten the prayer from 4 to 2 for the Asr and the Zohar. And Ibn Abbas, his position was that it should shorten 2. And Uthman's position was that you should make 4. And so Uthman is leading the prayer one day, and Ibn Abbas comes behind, and he follows, and he follows Uthman, and he prays 4. And when he finished, his students came to him and said, "But you just said it's supposed to be 2. How did you just pray 4?" And Ibn Abbas says, "Yes, I advocate for 2, but the unity of the Ummah is more important. So if I'm praying behind Uthman, I'm not going to do 2. I'm going to prefer to follow Uthman, who is the leader of this Salah, and to keep the unity of the Muslims." It is in this kind of spirit that we need to understand that, and if you are attending a local masjid, and for some reason you are so passionate about that they are not following the correct ruling, then on the day of, what you have to do is to go to whatever masjid you think is following your view, and maybe do the month of Ramadan there. But by and large, you will not lose any ajr or benefit by following your local masjid. In this case, as Abdullah bin Abbas showed us, that for the sake of unity, you go to your local masjid, celebrate Eid with them, you celebrate Ramadan with them, you break fast with them, and you follow their position there, even though individually you may disagree with their position. Now, the last thing we want to mention, and the scholars have also said, that there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which he said, the fast is the day the people fast, and the breaking of the fast is the day the people break their fast, and the sacrifice is the day the people sacrifice. This hadith is important in the sense that what the Prophet ﷺ said, at the end of the day, right, despite all the fights for who sight moon and whatever it is, the reality is that the day that the whole community pick as the day of fast, then that is the day of fasting. And the reality is that the day the community pick to break their fast, that is truly the day of breaking the fast. So that gives us an idea of the unity and the importance. And Prophet says, whatever the community decides is the day, that is the day. You keep your own individual opinion to yourself. Unity is very important. What day they decided that is the day of sacrifice, that is the day of sacrifice. And so this is a brief idea of that. There is a book that gives the support for calculations. It's called The Astronomical Calculation and Ramadan by Dr. Zulfikar Ali Shah. He is a senior member of the Islam Fiqh Council and the American Fiqh Council as well. So he wrote the book. It's about 165 pages, in which he explains in detail why it is valid to use calculation and not citing in our times for North American Muslims. So this issue, I want to reiterate, is always been contentious. You have, for example, when the moon gets sighted in Nigeria, people in Saudi or people who follow Saudi says, no, we don't trust Nigeria. And so you get this problem. Then you have people who are following moons, sighting only if it comes from their own countries. I'm waiting for Pakistan to see the moon, then I'm going to follow. All kinds of positions people adopt. But the one that is considered to have clear evidence is the local, the regional, and the global, and the calculation. And so if you pick any of these, we're fine. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to adopt something that makes sense. With the calculation, which I adopted for our masjid, it has really assisted our community to now plan and really make good preparation for Ramadan. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to be able to make good decisions. So inshallah, we finished a little bit early today. It's always been my goal to finish before 10 o'clock. So alhamdulillah.